It has been a year since we were told to lock down. Since we began to witness the radical changes made in Western civilization. This is the new normal. Critical theory, government worship, and cult-like behavior are sweeping across the planet faster than ever. History seems to be repeating itself, compounded by a manufactured pandemic that seems to have no clear end in sight. For a year now, the pandemic has been changing society down to the most fundamental level. Children are being raised in a sadistic environment, with little social contact or freedom. Parents are forced to the ground while their children cry in fear. Morality is now a tool to be used by extremists to propagate their psychotic ideologies.
What the fuck? Tonight, any night that we're out here is never about the motherfucking bikie boys. Yeah, we can start our topic as we're walking past, but never should we just be stopping.
The cyclical nature of history has never been more prevalent. "2 weeks to slow the spread." That's what we were told. Lockdown for 2 weeks, 15 days, so the hospitals won't get overwhelmed. So we can flatten the curve. But that's not what happened. Civilization was put on pause, something never before seen in human history. The curve was flattened, hospitals were not overwhelmed, yet we continued to stay at home and act as if the virus was worse than the 1918 flu pandemic. This is the current state of affairs we find ourselves in. And ever since the pandemic began, society has changed and adapted to the new normal faster than one would have hoped. Those who are skeptical of the pandemic and the efficacy of lockdowns are made into a pariah, labeled as conspiracy theorists. Those who try to broadcast the statistics and their contradiction to the government's reaction are removed from social media. All while the largest transfer of wealth in history is happening under the exponential growth of US currency. The world is on the verge of historical change, seen many times throughout history. The same patterns seen at the advent of totalitarian regimes are happening around the globe. The world's richest members of society are working together to change the world economic and social structure. And most of us have no idea what is in store. In fact, some even claim the efforts put forth by the upper echelon of society are a conspiracy theory. The World Economic Forum has had their plan for economic change on the internet for years. available to the public. How did this all happen so swiftly? Why was the public so easily led to accepting draconian declarations made by corrupt government institutions? And why is no one discussing the plans and ideas put forth by the world's richest men and women? Let's start at the beginning. Back when the pandemic first began, a confirmed case of the novel coronavirus emerged on the 17th of November 2019, according to reports of official government sources.
Over an outbreak of a new SARS-like virus in China.
The number of people infected and patients who have died keeps climbing. So here's what you need.
From the nation's most populous state, dire warnings of what's to come from its health.
News reports begin to come in of a novel coronavirus in China, with health authorities in the city of Wuhan acknowledge the existence of cases of viral pneumonia with unknown cause and a possible connection to the seafood market. The official statement online at the time denies human-to-human transmission or infection among health workers. There was also, quote, no clear evidence, unquote, of human-to-human transmission, meaning the virus wasn't yet spreading from one person to another, but instead, they suggested, from an animal to humans. This soon turned out to not be the case. To further confusion, Dr. Li, the first whistleblower about the virus, was forced by police to sign a letter saying he spread untrue speech for warning colleagues about the virus that eventually took his life. It was then on January 8th that the WHO told the world that the mysterious illness in China is likely caused by COVID-19, a virus in the same family that produced SARS and MERS. 2 days later, the CDC begins to screen for COVID at 3 US airports. The next day, China reports its first death related to the new virus, after which on January 12th, share the genetic sequences of the virus with the World Health Organization. The virus begins to find its way to other countries. Japan, January 15th. It is confirmed that the virus is transmissible between humans. It was then that the lockdowns began. On January 23rd, China quarantines Wuhan at 10 in the morning. 15 other cities in Hubei follow the next day. While China begins to shut down, the US media downplays the virus. NPR stated on January 29, 2020 that, quote, already this flu season, which generally begins in the US in October and peaks during winter months, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimates that more than 15 million people in the US have gotten sick with flu. More than 150,000 Americans have been hospitalized, and more than 8,000 people have died from their infection. And this isn't even a particularly bad flu year, unquote. Ironically, the next day on January 30th, the WHO declares the coronavirus a public health emergency. Following the announcement, President Trump announced that the United States would suspend entry to people who traveled to China in the past 14 days, excluding US citizens or their immediate family members. By that point, Chinese health officials had reported approximately 10,000 coronavirus cases and more than 200 deaths. However, other countries were beginning to report initial cases. There were at least 106 cases in 19 countries outside of China, according to a WHO situation report. Those nations included France, Germany, Italy, Canada, India, and Australia. Less than a week later, Carnival's Princess Cruises announced on February 4th that it was placing 3,700 passengers and crew under mandatory quarantine for 2 weeks after 10 people aboard the Diamond Princess in Yokohama, Japan, tested positive. More than 700 people aboard the ship would ultimately test positive for COVID-19 and multiple people died. At least 25 other cruise ships across the globe detected coronavirus cases in the month following, according to Nature, including the Grand Princess that was moored off the coast of California in early March. 3 days after Carnival's announcement, Dr. Lee passes away from the very illness he warned the world weeks earlier. It was then that the WHO announced a name for the disease caused by the coronavirus, COVID-19. Soon, new cases surged tenfold from the previous day after Hubei's health department changed its criteria for counting infections. It was around this time that the media starts to take COVID more seriously. With headlines such as "We are at a turning point, the coronavirus outbreak is looking more like a pandemic." Then the US experienced its first recorded death from the disease in Washington state. Soon, New York City begins reporting growing cases. A woman who had recently traveled to Iran became the first recorded case of COVID-19 in the city, and in New York State on March 1st, officials reported. Just over a week later, the number of cases in New York began to spike to more than 400, the most of any state, though New York Governor Andrew Cuomo warned there were likely thousands and thousands of cases already walking around the state. He told residents that New York officials expected the coronavirus to spread rapidly like it did in countries like China, South Korea, and Italy. The death toll in Washington begins to rise, with 6 deaths by March 3rd. 6 days later, Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte expanded Italy's lockdown to the entire nation on March 9th, as Italy's case count grew well above its European counterparts, reporting more than 1,000 new cases daily for the first time. The lockdown was seen as one of the most extensive efforts taken by a government outside of China to curb COVID-19. The world began to see what lied ahead of them. A global pandemic. Unprecedented change. The WHO declared the coronavirus a global pandemic after COVID-19 infected more than 121,000 people and killed at least 4,300. By that point, daily new cases in China and South Korea had significantly declined, while Italy and Iran were reporting growing outbreaks. That same day, the president announced travelers from Europe to the US would be banned for 30 days, applying only to countries in the Schengen Economic and Travel Zone. The United Kingdom and Ireland were exempt from the restriction. On March 13th, the WHO's Tedros said Europe was the new epicenter for COVID-19 cases. Europe has now become the epicenter of the pandemic, with more reported cases and deaths than the rest of the world combined, apart from China, Tedros said at a news briefing. More cases are now being reported every day than were reported in China at the height of its epidemic. Italy had the worst outbreak with more than 15,100 cases, followed by Spain with over 2,900 and France with more than 2,800. While other European countries were reporting less than 100 deaths, Italy's death toll had grown above 1,000. March 16, 2020. Faced with a growing outbreak, France's President, Emmanuel Macron, ordered the country to stay at home for up to 15 days, saying the nation was in a health war. France's total number of cases had grown from 130 on March 1st to more than 6,600 by March 16th. The country would later surpass China's total number of reported cases on April 3rd with more than 83,000 cases. Macron's order came the same day Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau closed the country's borders to non-citizens with the exception of travelers from the US March 27, 2020. This is when the global lockdowns began to emerge. This was when we were told to lock down for 15 days, so hospitals wouldn't get overwhelmed. On March 15th, the CDC issued guidance recommending against any gathering of 50 or more people for an 8-week period. Arizona orders all of their schools closed until March 27th. Connecticut also orders all of their schools to close, taking effect the next day until March 31st. 4 other states announced school closures. Illinois and Ohio order restaurants and bars to close. Oklahoma, North and South Carolina declare states of emergency. Over the next week, every other state within the United States implemented their lockdowns. By the end of March, it was reported that the US had 3,170 deaths, 164,620 confirmed cases, and 1.07 million tests completed. On the 1st of April, it was clear that schools were not going to begin instruction anytime soon, with Indiana Superintendent of Public Instruction Jennifer McCormick directing that Indiana schools close for the rest of the academic year, and that they continue providing instruction remotely. After several states' lockdowns expire, some order an extension until the end of April. The AP reported on April 14th that Dr. Anthony Fauci said Tuesday that the US does not yet have the critical testing and tracing procedures needed to begin reopening the nation's economy. Fauci said that a May 1st target is a bit overly optimistic for many areas of the country. Any easing off the strict social distancing rules in place in much of the country would have to occur on a rolling basis, not all at once. This was also when President Trump announced his decision to halt US funding to the WHO, alleging the US would review their mismanagement and cover up efforts. WHO officials disputed his allegations the following day, saying that the world was alerted January 5th. This would turn out to be a lie after reports emerged months later that the virus had been known since November of 2019. Something isn't right. The lockdowns didn't end, nor did the school closures. And the public wasn't sitting quietly, with a large-scale rally called Operation Gridlock taking place in Lansing to protest Governor Whitmer's stay-at-home order. Days later, on April 18th, dozens protest outside of the governor's mansion in Indianapolis after the issue of the latest stay-at-home order. People were beginning to notice that the lockdowns were not working. A few states began to open up, however, with plans announced the following week of a phased reopening schedule. This would involve restrictions and limits to gatherings. By the end of the month, several states had extended their state of emergency. But then on April 30th, Ohio's Governor DeWine announced in a press conference that he will extend the stay-at-home order. The only problem? He does not give a specific date. The economic toll began to take effect when Governor DeWine discusses the state's economy during a press conference. At the end of February, Ohio was $200 million ahead of projections for the year. Ohio then had a projected budget shortfall of $776.9 million for the fiscal year, which ended June 30th. May 26, 2020. George Floyd is killed by police in Minneapolis. This was the progenitor of the riots that followed, and continue to this day almost a year later. What was once empty, silent streets soon burst into a mosaic of people, thousands marching for what they call justice. The video of this tragic event soon hit social media and spread like wildfire. The news cycles shifted abruptly to cover these new events, almost as if the pandemic had never happened. Yet, while thousands hit the streets to protest, the media was still vilifying those who wanted to open the economy back up and return to work. If you wished to protest the lockdown, the governmental authorities would step in and fine you, while outlets such as CNN or MSNBC championed the protests for Floyd. And to make matters worse, so-called medical experts began to choose ideological sides, clarifying that protesting for social justice was acceptable, but to make a distinction that if you protested the lockdowns, you would be cast as a health risk. Truth had been obfuscated by the media. The world seems to have entered a state of undeniable hypocrisy and self-serving fantasy. The facts no longer match the expectations of reality.